Hey folks, Schneider here. Had a lot of very interesting responses to several of the YouTube posts, the uncomfortable questions, the conversation that we're engaged in. So I'm amazed because so many people have done so much research now, rather than just say what they were taught to say. There was a wonderful song in South Pacific called "You've Got to Be Taught." South Pacific, I think, was done in the early 60s. Listen to some of these lyrics. You've got to be taught you've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. This was an amazing song, and it was very controversial at the time. I think they even took it out of the movie. But look for it. Look for the South Pacific soundtrack, and listen to the song "You've Got to Be Taught." Of course, at that point, it was about Americans and Japanese falling in love in the South Pacific, which they said, no, this can't happen. And of course, some people said that. Other people said, good on you. I mean, if you're fortunate enough to find someone that you actually love, that actually loves you back, who in the world can tell you who that person should be? But that's another story. So, heard a lot of things research-wise, and it appears a lot of people were saying things about how, yes, there were black soldiers, but they were forced, or black folks in the Confederacy, free men of color in the Confederacy, but they were afraid they were going to be turned back into slaves. And then other people had said, wait a minute, time out, something that not a lot of people know, and now I know it, and I didn't know, is that the assumption, because of the way I was taught, was that every black man, woman, and child in the United States, North and South, prior to the Civil War, was a slave. Not true. Not true. There were also Chinese slaves. There were Irish slaves. There were lots of people who were slaves, but not all of those people were slaves. I kind of thought they were. So when I asked the question about free men of color, it doesn't really apply that they were worried they would be turned back into slaves, because they had never been slaves, according to the things that were written at the time. And again, I stress that. Read things that were written at the time, as close to when the history was actually happening as possible. But here's something that came up time and time again, and I've heard it all my life. The Civil War, and by the way, when it was happening, it was not called the Civil War. It was called the Civil War later by the victors. Okay, during that time, it was called the War of Secession, the War of Northern Aggression. It was called many, many things, but it was never called the Civil War. The Great War, it was called at some point. I think Lincoln called it this Great War, not meaning a great war, but a great bad, monstrous war. Did you know that you could fill the Superdome in New Orleans almost 7 times? Of course, I've heard different numbers. I've heard 650,000. I've heard 700 and something thousand. So let's average those out. You could fill the Superdome in New Orleans 7 times to capacity with the number of people who died in the Civil War. Crazy, crazy number. And of course, all Americans. So here's the thing that came up, and it made me say, wait a minute. What does that mean? The Civil War where brother was put against brother. It's very poetic. It's like a novel. It's like something Hemingway would have written. And I don't know who wrote it because I don't know what that actually means. You know, nowadays we travel. My brother lives in New York. I live in Louisiana. My other brother lives in Florida and sometimes Connecticut. You know, we're a very scattered people now. I don't think in 1860 and 1861 we were that. So what that indicates is that when the news came out that this war was going to happen, and remember, there was no internet, there was no television, there was no radio, it was actually newspapers and word of mouth. Also, no one knew where anybody was because you couldn't say, hey, Charlie, where are you? We're over here on the mountain. We're at Kennesaw. Where are you? Nothing. Had to rely on people on horseback giving you information, doing reconnaissance. And then you had to trust them that they were telling you the truth. And if you'd never met them, how could you do that? That's another story. Or another question. So what does that mean, brother against brother? Does that mean that in a household, somebody said, I think this is great, and the other one said, I think this is bad, and one of them moved to Ohio or Pennsylvania and put on a blue suit while the other one put on a gray suit? What does that mean? Somebody out there tell me what that means. Or does it mean we were all a wonderful, happy family of people in the North and people in the South and people in between, and this caused dysfunction? I don't think that's what it means. I just don't know. I don't know what brother against brother means. So would you tell me? I really would like to know. And please, if you're still hesitant to believe, as I was, that there were free men of color who willfully put on a gray uniform and fought for the Confederacy, look it up, and look for the pensions that were paid out to those folks and their families afterwards. Pensions will tell you what really happened. Now, I have had some people say, well, they were in the band and they were cooks, they were not military. Well, I tell you what, I beg to differ. I've heard many, many times, another very poetic thing, that an army runs on its stomach. So if that's true now, then it certainly was true then. We had a wonderful man named Robert Aaron Stevens that was part of Dukes of Hazzard. He was Uncle Jesse's stand-in and sometimes doubled for him. Well, Bobby was a CB, not hey, Breaker 19, a CB. And his job was in the Army, in the CBs, to feed thousands of people every day. You can't tell me that Bobby was not a soldier because he fed people. A weapon does not make you a soldier. A heart for the cause, whatever it is, and a desire to feed your army, your Navy, your Marines, your people, is what makes you part of that action. So for those of you, and by the way, my dad was in the Air Force. My dad didn't fly a plane, he didn't fix a plane. He flew planes later, he wanted to, but my dad played a tuba in the band. If anyone, when my dad was alive, had said, well, then you weren't in the military, he'd have hit him with that tuba and I'd have helped him. if you're in the band, if you're in the honor guard, if you are a cook, if you're in transportation, if you're the guy or girl that makes roads and builds huts so people can go, if you're the folks that put the tents up, you are in the military, and we appreciate what you have done and what you are doing. So for those of you who said, yes, there were free men of color in the Confederacy, but they were only cooks, or they were only in the band, then I respectfully request that you reassess that perspective, because music makes people happy. The bugler is a very important part of the cavalry. The cook, I saw the cowboys, Mr. Neitlinger, Roscoe Lee Brown, love you, Roscoe, was my next door neighbor in California, was the single most important part of making sure the cattle got to Belle Fourche. So, if that's true, and I believe that is, then the cooks on both sides of what we now call the Civil War were every bit as important as a sharpshooter. Okay? So, please research. I'm going to do it too. I'm going to go find out why do we always say the Civil War pit brother against brother. I want to know why. Thanks for being in the conversation. We're going to ask another question next week, because the great thing about this, as in all conversations where you actually listen, I've not read all 8,000 comments, but I've read a couple of hundred. When you actually listen to answers to great questions, what do they cause? More great questions. It's up to us to answer these questions for ourselves. Let's not rely on the condensed version of the Cliff Notes because we're in such a hurry to play some game on our phone. People are telling us things, and have been. I'm 60. People have been telling me things. I'm not going to say they're not true, but they're not, what is it called? The sin of omission. They have omitted things for the sake of, I don't know if it's my feelings or time. I don't think we should enjoy that luxury anymore, and I do not think a condensed version of our history is doing anyone anything but a disservice. Okay? If you agree, let's keep talking. If you don't, of course, that's your right. Go for it. Run out and live your life your way. I live my life my way. I'm just trying to help people get along a little better, and nothing will help you get along better than by chatting with someone you've never met before. I'm John Schneider. Thanks for being in the conversation. I'll see you next week. Bye.